I'm Tamara Banks. Mitch, so great to see you again.
Good to see you, Tamara.
I'm really excited about our guest, Dr. James Caruso. Thanks you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been in Denver for just under 2 years, coming from Tennessee. How do you like us so far?
I love Denver. I never saw this on the horizon for our future, but when the offer to come to Denver came up, we jumped at it.
Great. Well, we're glad to have you. And a lot of people don't really understand all that goes into your job as a medical examiner, ME, as we hear a lot. Tell us a little bit about your duties and what they entail.
Well, the Office of the Medical Examiner is charged with assigning cause and manner of death to any death that occurs in the city and county of Denver. Now, many of those deaths do not need intervention from the Office of the Medical Examiner, but the ones that do are deaths that occur suddenly, unexpectedly, violent deaths, or deaths that are just completely unattended by any medical personnel.
And so how is that different from a coroner?
Well, a coroner is an elected position, and Colorado is a coroner state, so there's a coroner for every county in the state of Colorado. I happen to be the coroner for Denver County. However, Denver is the only county that requires their coroner to be a board-certified forensic pathologist or medical examiner. And so I wear two hats. Coroners will sign death certificates and they will assign cause and manner of death, but if they're not forensic pathologists, they have to have a pathologist perform the autopsy. In our office, board-certified forensic pathologists perform all the autopsies and sign the death certificates.
Okay, I gotcha. And so, Mitch, I imagine, obviously, this position is crucial to the investigations in your department.
Yeah, when we're talking about homicides, we're talking about murders, the degree of murder, those kinds of things. One of the pivotal people, obviously, in a murder trial is somebody from the coroner's office, somebody from the medical examiner's office, and it's great that we have that advantage in Denver, that everybody that works there actually is a medical examiner, trained doctor, knows what they're doing. And there are times when what they testify to is the pivotal piece in the case. Oftentimes it's not, but we still have to show cause of death. We still have to talk about the manner of death, those kinds of things. Because that plays into the mental states that we have to prove. The number of gunshots, for instance, usually will show somebody was acting intentionally, that somebody was actually thinking about what they were doing as opposed to it being one shot, accidental, that kind of thing. So, like oftentimes it isn't what makes or breaks the case, and sometimes it is when we're talking about babies and those types of deaths, but it is the kind of evidence that we build on then to make arguments of things that we have to prove in the trial. So it's critical to have that testimony, that expert testimony. The other thing that happens is that on a lot of cases that we have to make a filing decision itself. We rely heavily upon what is found there as far as how intoxicated the person was the cause of death, something like a heart attack as opposed to somebody being choked, that kind of thing. So what I really rely on them for is, do I make a filing? Do I file at all? Here we've got a death, a police officer may have been involved or a sheriff, but it may be called a homicide by the doctor, but is it technically, legally, something that I can prove as one of those homicides that is a crime in Colorado? So, I've many a time relied on the coroner's office to not, make a filing at all. And so you don't charge somebody because you can't prove it. And I think that's as important as anything else that we do. And you don't want to falsely file or accuse somebody of something as serious as taking somebody's life if you can't prove it.
And you guys are some of the best in the nation. I understand you're nationally accredited. What are some of the things you're doing that sets you above the others?
Well, the National Association of Medical Examiners accredits medical examiners' offices, and there's only 5 offices in the state of Colorado that are accredited. Denver is one of them, and there are fewer than 100, probably fewer than 75 nationwide. So what that means is that we adhere to some generally accepted collegial standards that the medical examiners as a whole nationwide have set as a bar for performing autopsies, tracking evidence, tracking lab tests, getting autopsy reports out in a reasonable time frame, interacting with the families, the next of kin. And we're about to have our reaccreditation come up in the next couple weeks, and one of my colleagues is a medical examiner on the East Coast. Will be traveling here, and he will run us through the ringer and make sure we're still doing it right.
And to add on top of that is your workload. As I mentioned earlier, you can do as many as, on average, 6 autopsies a day, some days fewer, some days more. But that's a lot of work. Your day must start pretty early.
It does. The techs and even the doctors are in usually around 6:30 or so in the morning. We hold a morning meeting with the investigators, the administrative personnel, and the doctors, and we plan our activities. And of course, if there's a case that has police interest, and we know that homicide detectives and the crime lab will be coming, we have to organize that around everybody's schedule. And it can be a really long day, and we do autopsies every day of the week. It's a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day operation.
Tamara, let me give you an example of how important that is. We had a girl that went missing. She ended up being the victim of a homicide. We found her in Weld County, and she was buried there. We dug her up, and at a point where we were about to get her down to Denver, the coroner there, who was not a medical examiner, said, "Well, wait a minute. I want to hold the body." And we had to get the district attorney up there involved, and they said, "Well, listen, if it really is what the Denver police think it is, let Denver take it." And the important thing is that we got her out of the ground, the crime lab, and one of your investigators was up there helping, and we got her out, and by 10 o'clock the next morning, I was meeting with the family. I got the call that she'd been identified. Her remains had been identified as these folks' daughter. We would have had to wait weeks had that coroner up there held on to the body. So the idea that a family is waiting for answers, and your office, they give them an answer. Sometimes that next morning, first thing in the morning, 9:30, 10 o'clock, you're able to tell the family that is in fact your loved one. You can't maybe give them the details of how they died, but I sat and looked at that mother, and when we told her, because their hope was always that this wasn't their daughter, that their daughter was somewhere and still alive, but be able to give her that answer that quickly, because it was all over the media that we were digging up this girl and all of that, was really important to that family. And that's why this office is so important to us and to the people of Denver.
And it must be on some level comforting to the people know exactly what happened, or at least they know that this is their loved one or not, which, again, leads to why you're working 24/7, maybe not you personally, but pretty long hours for a coroner. And or for a ME, your office is only, what, half a dozen people?
Well, actually, we have 21 staff total. Now, there are 3 full-time forensic pathologists, and we also train a forensic pathologist every year, so we have a fellowship program. So there's 4 doctors and 7 full-time investigators, and then we have administrative staff. So it's a modest number of people for the amount of work we do. There's about 6,500 deaths in Denver every year. About 4,500 of those come to the attention of our office, and of those we take significant action in over 1,000.
So where you're housed now, you're about to be evicted on some level. Not really evicted, but you're going to have to move out of your old stomping grounds. First, tell us where you're located and where you think you might be moving.
Well, we're on Bannock Street, right across the street from the Denver Health Emergency Room entrance, which is a good location for us right now. So we're on the Denver Health campus. And when I got to Denver, I was told that in about 5 years we would get a new building. It was obvious to me that we had outgrown our spaces. It's very cramped. We have records that date back to the first part of the 20th century. And that seemed like a reasonable timeline. And then within a month or two, I was told that a wrecking ball would probably be coming to the building sometime within the next couple of years, and we needed to find a new location. So we began a quick search. We worked in partnership with Denver Health and the city, and we have a new location identified, and currently the blueprints are being drawn up for what won't be a new building. It'll be a building that Denver Health has in their inventory, but it'll be twice the square footage, and the inside will be brand new. And that's going to be a real nice change for my staff.
You know, that I've been around a long time, and I remember before they moved in the building they're in, and they used to be in the basement of Denver Health. Mm-hmm. And I distinctly remember having meetings with the doctors there where basically somebody had to pull kind of a bench aside so you could have a place to sit down. It was so cramped, it was unbelievable. Then they moved over there and it was like, oh, this is great. You know, they have a conference room we can sit down in. And we've had a lot of really important meetings there. But like so many things, like our crime lab, those types of things, the space just gets eaten up. And, you know, it's interesting to come in and have that dropped on you with that short a notice. But you know, the nice thing about it's always been close. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like it'll be a little further drive for us, but you know, obviously the facility is important. Having the equipment can speed things up, make things better. So, you know, we certainly understand that the change it's timely.
And it's got to be good for morale to have some little, you know, professional looking space and some elbow room, I imagine.
The staff is very much looking forward to it, and Denver Health has been a great partner in this. They immediately said, how can we work this out so that you'll still be part of our family, and then the city, the folks in real estate and budget, and in particular the safety area of the city, because my folks work very physical jobs. Sometimes you have to move bodies, you have to be out on crime scenes and things like that. So different parts of the city have come to bat for us and helped us develop the plan for the new facility.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. It's not exactly the most glamorous job you can have. What drives you to want to do this kind of work?
Well, you're right. The TV shows depict, you know, pumps and high heels and glamour and CSI, and it's none of that. It's very difficult work and under some extreme circumstances, but the bottom line is that, as Mitch has already said, we need to find closure for the families. We need to give them an idea of what happened to their loved one. We need to allow them to settle affairs and have their loved one either buried or cremated or whatever is necessary. And again, we are the witnesses for that individual who can no longer speak. And so if something has happened to someone to result in their death, they can't tell their story. I have to tell their story for them, and that's what our doctors do.
They also collect an incredible amount of evidence for us, and so they work hand in hand with the crime lab. And the doctor talked about the whole idea of they are the beginning of the chain of custody. Mm-hmm. And so they will do rape examinations on victims that have been murdered. They will collect the bullets. They will do all of that. The crime scene unit is there. People from the crime lab sometimes are there for parts of the autopsy and the collection of that. But they really are the cornerstone then of homicide prosecutions. Remember, first-degree murder has no statute of limitations, so we can bring these charges, you know, long after many medical examiners have retired. Mm-hmm. And Denver is lucky. We still have George Ogura, who's in his 90s, who I believe testified at least once last year on one of our cold cases. Wow. So sometimes, even though people are in retirement, in this job, you get that knock on the door, or that subpoena, or that call, and say, we've solved that case that you did the autopsy on 30 years ago. Wow. You collected the evidence, we're going to have to call you. And so we keep pretty good contact mm-hmm. with the people that have worked in this office. And I can tell you, I've been 30 years, and I never got to work with Dr. Ogura. I do know Dr. Ogura, but he had retired by the time I started 30 years ago. We still use him as a witness. But we have had some great people in that position. And, you know, we'll get cops that refuse to come back, and we'll get people that, but I've never heard of that from the doctors that we've had. We've had a couple that we had just for a short period of time, and they get they're kind of difficult. But the ones that have really run that office mm-hmm. and run it for long periods of time, they're committed to what they do even long after they've retired.
Really great, amazing. You have spent 30 years in the Navy, right?
That's correct.
And you sort of did medical examining on the side. Tell us a little bit about that. That wasn't necessarily your day job.
Well, at the end, it ended up not being my day job, but I was trained by the military to do medical examiner work. But I started in the Navy as a medical student. I had no other way to pay for medical school, and they paid for medical school, and I owed them time after that. And we managed to go back and forth over the years, and every time I thought I had options and wanted to move on, the Navy gave me some options that I decided I liked, and I woke up one day and I had been in uniform for almost 30 years. So.
And you've done some autopsies on some people that we wouldn't necessarily think of in Iraq, and not our U.S. soldiers, but also the terrorists or accused terrorists.
That's correct. I was the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner for the Department of Defense, and so as such, any case that was of interest to the Department of Defense that needed a forensic autopsy would come under our jurisdiction. Deaths in custody are very, very important and high-profile deaths, and so anybody who was in Abu Ghraib prison, for instance, and died, or anybody who was in the custody of the U.S. forces, perhaps being questioned or detained and died, required a forensic autopsy. And so I and several of my colleagues who were on the staff with me would go over to Iraq and do autopsies in a combat zone in some very, very meager conditions.
The pressure to do that must have been incredible, not just to be in that combat zone, but I wonder too to have the freedom to kind of give the results that you think are true.
Yes, and you know that exists in any medical examiner office. Certainly there are parties that will not like your answers, whether it's you know, the DA's office sometimes may not agree with what we find, or not like the answers they're getting, or or law enforcement. But you have to be transparent, you have to be straightforward, and you have to be factual and scientific in your approach. And when you take it to the federal level, then it becomes even more of a potential conflict. I can say, though, that nobody ever coerced me or strong-armed me to make any designation other than what I felt was to be true, and I can say that both at the federal level and at the local level as a practicing medical examiner.
So Mitch, we must be pretty lucky to have this kind of expertise here in Denver.
Yeah, and the fact that everybody there is a medical examiner, that's so big, because in these jurisdictions, especially the smaller ones where these people are elected, they don't have to even be a doctor necessarily, so you might get the local mortician. That's why I was telling you the Weld County story, because that person, you know, there were a couple of different times where I got some pretty frantic calls from that crime scene. And you know, we were there to dig this girl up. We were going to be there till we got her dug up. We weren't going to take a break at 4 and go home. And, you know, those were the kind of things that this guy wanted to do, and it was like, whoa, wait a minute. And you know, I have seen medical examiners at crime scenes with me where the body's there at 3 in the morning in Denver. That's the kind of service that we're used to. So yeah, it's a huge advantage to us.
I want to talk about this research that you're embracing around suicide deaths. Tell us a little bit more about that and how that's coming together.
Well, as much as I've fallen in love with Colorado and Denver, it perplexes me that we have such a high suicide rate. You know, with all the sunshine and outdoor activities and beautiful weather, Colorado actually has a fairly significant suicide rate compared to other parts of the country. And so that question has come up quite often. Why is Colorado's suicide rate high? Why is Denver's suicide rate high? When I arrived in Denver, I quickly met a number of colleagues that work for the city and county, and one of them is the head of the crime lab, Greg LaBerge. And Greg is a geneticist by background, and he had this idea that I think he and Mitch had gone over before my arrival, that perhaps we could put some of the data that the medical examiner's office has to good use in looking at suicides. And so we have a multi-city collaboration in the works to look at the genetic basis of suicide. And we will, in partnership with the University of Colorado Medical School, look at all of our suicides and try to come up with any commonalities in the genetic database that we have for maybe a potential predisposition to folks that take their own lives.
That's pretty incredible to think that perhaps it's genetic, and that means possibly then there could be some treatment on the front end before somebody takes their life.
Yeah, if somebody has the genes for it, it'd be something to watch for, and I think that it really shows the true nature of the collaboration of things. You know, Greg we talked about this. Well, you know, there's a blood card for everybody that committed suicide over at the ME's office. That can be genetically tested for this type of study. It's a medical study. It's not really anything that we're all involved in the criminal justice system, but certainly the suicide rate is a very big concern for all of us. So the idea to have that, and then Dr. Caruso comes in and yeah, he's all for it, and he says, oh, we'll get other cities, and he uses his collaboration in his field and gets other cities involved. So it's an exciting thing. I think that it helps scientists stay fresh and to continue to do kind of that science, asking those kinds of questions. I know that's important when you're doing the day-to-day grind, that to set aside a little time to do something that's scientifically, research-wise important to your community. So I just think that things like that are great.
Right, that collaboration can really save lives. Let's talk a little bit about the program called NAMUS. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, NAMUS, and it's it stands for the National Missing Persons. I'm not exactly sure, but it was really started by a call by MEs across this country that had a lot of unidentified remains. And so what the National Institute of Justice did is it called on the National Forensic Science Training Center to build a system, which is a computer-based system, which allows you, if you have a missing person, to go online, put down details about your loved one who's missing. And somebody in an ME's office is doing the same thing with the unidentified remains that they have. So if somebody's had a hip replacement, they're putting down what those medical devices were, what their numbers are, that kind of thing, tattoos, anything unique about the person, dental records, DNA, that type of thing. And you can go online then, type in your missing persons details, and the computer may hook them up. And nationally, you'll read about these kinds of remains being identified. There was one up in Boulder not all that long ago. That NAMUS pulled it together and gave families an answer, which is really important. Sometimes then you can start a homicide investigation. And it really was Dr. Caruso's profession that made this call. They said, we have so many of these across the country. We really need to work on something to give these families answers.
So it's back to that, what you said earlier about giving answers to families, and that's what really drives you. What are the next 30 years look like for you?
Well, I hope to be in Denver till I have a second retirement from the medical examiner's office at some point. But and I should say also the other role of the medical examiner's office is public health. It's something we haven't really touched on, but the medical examiner's office is often the first to be aware of infectious diseases that are spreading. Suicide awareness, of course, is a public health issue. So I think of us as public health doctors, and I hope to work with the city and county of Denver to advance the public health of our citizens. That's my goal.
That's great. Well, it's great to have you here in Denver. We're glad that we took you from Tennessee, and hopefully the winters won't be too difficult on you, and you'll stick around a long, long time. Doctor, thanks so much for being with us. Thank you to Dr. James Caruso, Chief Medical Examiner in Denver, for being our guest today with Denver DA Mitch Morrissey on this edition of Dialogue Denver DA. I'm Tamara Banks. We'll see you next time.